The purpose of tonight's meeting is really to consider some of the main ideas of Erich Fromm and to give, as I said, particular attention to how he relates to some of the issues that we are facing in today's world. I think Fromm can be of great assistance in helping us set a goal for our culture and our discourse and keeping us on the right path as human beings. But before I enter that, let me make two preliminary observations, if I may. First, this will not be a comprehensive exposition of Fromm's thought. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is we're running around 60 minutes or so, and it would be impossible to present an exhaustive view of everything Fromm said or wrote about. There are indeed college courses and seminars that spend whole semesters and even years dealing with his thought. One could easily plumb the depths of Fromm's writings in one of those courses and even still come away not having fully exhausted all that he has to say. Second reason that we will not be exhaustive is the rather expansive nature of Erich Fromm's work. He's the author, depending on how you want to count, of around 35 books. These works cover a wide range of topics, from philosophy, psychology, psychoanalysis, social criticism, sociology, and religion, and so forth. I came across a while back an apt description of Fromm's work that was written by John Dollard in the New York Herald Tribune, where he characterized Erich Fromm as at once a sociologist, philosopher, historian, psychoanalyst, economist, and anthropologist. And then he added, and one is tempted to add, lover of human life, a poet, and a prophet. And I certainly think if you know anything about Erich Fromm, that really expresses the comprehensive breadth of his work. With a description like that, it's obviously not just difficult, but near impossible to do justice to Erich Fromm's whole corpus in 20 minutes or so. Nevertheless, I do hope to be able to kind of whet your appetite for further reading, or if you've not read anything of Fromm, to pick up one of his books or more in the time that I want to share this, by focusing on what I think are some of his key ideas and how in particular they apply to political and social discourse in our world today, in our nation, and in the larger world. Now that brings me to my second preliminary statement that I really want to stress, and that is that the things I share with you tonight represent my own personal interpretation and reading of Erich Fromm, and are really designed to encourage you to enter into a dialogue with Fromm and develop your own reading. I think that whenever any of us encounters a text, that is to say, when we are reading, our relationship to that text and the purpose of using it can be kind of on an arc or a continuum that moves from what I call information to formation. Like all humanistic writers, Fromm is focusing on human nature. And so we read Erich Fromm, or at least I do, to not just gather facts about who he was or what he had to say, but really to help wrestle with what I think, and it's nothing unique. I think if you read widely, you recognize that great authors are really grappling with the great questions of human existence. And those, I think, can resolve themselves very generally into three questions. Who am I? What should I be doing? And where am I going? And I think that Erich Fromm helps us with that. Clearly, I'm not suggesting tonight that what I have expressed and experienced in reading Fromm is the definitive interpretation of his life and work, but rather it is, to some degree, the engagement I have had with him, the impact he's made upon me. And I offer these insights to encourage you to a further conversation and formative reading of Erich Fromm. In order to accomplish that, I want to pose three additional questions. One is, who was Erich Fromm? We'll just look briefly at his biography. Second of all, what are some of his central ideas? And thirdly, what is, of course, the significance of those ideas for us today? Now, as we come down to look at these concerns, I think we need to constantly keep in mind, as I say, not only Erich Fromm's context, but our context as well, in the way that these two things can be brought together. Fromm's life, as we're trying to answer the question, who was Erich Fromm? His life was, broadly speaking, lived within the confines of the 20th century. And his experience and writings, I think, are shaped by many of the great events that occurred during his lifetime, which included things like World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the rise and development of nuclear energy and the potential that war held for destroying the planet, as well as the events that were taking place in what was called the Cold War. He was born March 23rd, 1900, is the only child in an Orthodox Jewish household. His father was a businessman, I think, but don't quote me on this. He was a wine merchant, but he was definitely a businessman. And yet the household was very religious, and indeed had before it a number of significant thinkers in Judaism. His grandfather and both of his great-grandfathers on his father's side were rabbis. He had a great uncle on his mother's side who was a noted Talmudic scholar. And so even though Erich himself ended up not being a practicing Jew or practicing Judaism, he nonetheless was very influenced, I think, by his Jewish heritage. And he spent time himself dealing with that heritage and wrote a number of books on religion and even on Talmudic studies in the Old Testament and so forth. He began his academic career in 1918, started by attending the University of Frankfurt, the hometown in which he was born, where he began to study jurisprudence. But in 1919, he moved to the University of Heidelberg, and he continued his studies there in the area of sociology. He studied principally under Alfred Weber, a name you may not recognize, but Alfred Weber was the brother of the more famous Max Weber, sometimes in the US referred to as Max Weber, but it's actually Max Weber. In addition to studying with Weber, Alfred Weber, he also studied under the famous philosopher Karl Jaspers, again, sometimes referred to as Jaspers in the English language. And then he received his doctorate in sociology in 1922. He wrote his dissertation on Jewish law, interestingly enough. Then in the 1920s, he began training to become a psychoanalyst, and he progressed enough that he was able to open his own practice in 1927. He later joined the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research and completed his study and psychoanalytic training in 1930. Just a slight anomaly to note, this was the era when most people training for psychoanalysis were from the medical profession. And so at this point in time, Freudian slip, Fromm was himself not trained in medicine, but his background was in sociology. Obviously, as a Jew, when the Nazis took over Germany, beginning in the early 30s, Fromm moved from Germany to Geneva. And then in 1934, he moved to the US, where he taught in various schools until 1949, when he moved to Mexico and taught at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, returning occasionally to the States from 57 to 61 to be a visiting professor. He was at Michigan State during that time. And then after he retired in 1974, he moved from Mexico to Switzerland, where he died at his home on March 18th, 1980, just 5 days before what would have been his 80th birthday. Now, there are a lot more things we can say about Erich Fromm, including his own relationships with various persons, but I think that's sufficient to give us an overview of who Erich Fromm was. More importantly, the question now comes before us: what are some of Fromm's leading ideas? And this is one, Mark, I regretted that I said yes to this, because, you know, there are so many things that we could talk about. And I spent quite a bit of time, not so much trying to expand this as to shrink down all of the various areas. If you're interested in economics, and in particular an analysis of modern capitalism, Erich Fromm is someone worth reading. If you are interested in general human history, he is someone worth reading. If you are especially interested in the development of the modern world from the time of the Reformation and the Renaissance up until our present day, Erich Fromm is someone to read. Certainly, he writes a lot about the development of the human personality, and you can find in his writings ways in which he embraces some of Freud's work, but also then for a while was part of that what's called neo-Freudian school, where he clearly modifies some of those ideas. So there's just a lot of good stuff in Erich Fromm's work, and I would really encourage anyone who has not read much of him to pick up one or more of his books. And at the end of this, I'll suggest a couple of places where I think you ought to start if you have not read anything by Fromm. But I think the effort to grasp his thought, I've tried to boil down into what I think are 4 major points or observations. And the first is that human evolution is more than just a biological journey. Whenever we think about evolution, we naturally think of Darwin and we think about biology. And certainly Erich Fromm is fully aware of those studies, but he sees life as more than just a biological journey. It has not only a biological dimension, but it has a psychological dimension, a sociological dimension, and one might even say, and I think he would not be uncomfortable with this, a spiritual dimension as we journey together into wholeness. More to the point, life is a journey, to use one of his dominant metaphors, a journey from freedom into freedom. And Fromm traces in various degrees and in various contexts the personal journey that all of us undertake, as well as the social journey with its many contexts, its many problems, its many issues as we move on to maturity. He uses that term, but again, as I say, I think one of the dominant images for Erich Fromm is this image of freedom. But he mentions that freedom has 2 sides. There is a freedom from something. We are, as part of this evolutionary journey, emancipated, set free from the bondage of nature in the animal world when human self-consciousness begins. Fromm has some very interesting observations on the story in the Hebrew Bible about the Garden of Eden and paradise and the way in which Adam and Eve were expelled from paradise. He sees that as the rise of self-consciousness and awareness, the exercise of free will. Tends to see that in a little bit more positive light than many in the Judeo-Christian tradition tend to do. He also sees analogies in that socially to our birth from the womb, as we are emancipated from our total dependence on a mother. Even though as we are given birth, we still have a continuing and necessary relationship with mother. But all of these, Fromm says, when these emancipations occur, it is a freedom from. At the same time, Fromm challenges us to not only look at where we've come from and that from which we have been emancipated, but also to look to where we are going, to look forward to freedom for or freedom to, something which is positive, which is true, which is just, and which is good. So I think the first thing to realize about Erich Fromm is he sees human nature as part of an ongoing journey. Second broad concept I would like to bring to our attention is the idea that this journey is not an easy one. For every emancipation, every freedom from, we are not only placed in a new situation, but we have a problem before us. When we are given this new freedom, we really have two choices. We can actualize it and continue to move forward, or we can seek to escape from it. And often we do that because when we experience this newfound freedom, we immediately become frightened. We realize that we are alone. We realize that upon which we have depended is now apart from us. And so we can either actualize our freedom or we can try to escape from it as we find ourselves threatened and alone, and even to some degree alienated from ourselves, from nature and the world, and from other people. And that leads to the third observation. When we encounter this burden of freedom, often it does seem to be too much to bear. And so we seek to escape. Now, there are various mechanisms of escape that we can use. As a psychoanalyst, he looks at a number of those. But as someone who believes that the individual psyche is not fixed, but develops according to our social context, there are indeed a variety of mechanisms that we use. Two of the most notable for modern persons. And for Erich Fromm, the modern period would, as I alluded to earlier, roughly, especially for Western civilization, be that time from the Reformation and Renaissance to our own contemporary period. And the two significant escapes that we use during this time are either conformity or submission. Typically, and Fromm writes a lot about this, in modern capitalistic societies, in fact, in his book, The Sane Society, the largest chapter that occupies a major part of the book is an analysis of the social impact that modern capitalism and capitalist societies make on us. And one of the ways that we escape actualizing freedom is conformity. We simply become an automatic automaton, putting in our time, punching in, punching out, and so forth. But the other way in which we seek to come in. Pardon? Yeah, we did, 7 o'clock. That's quite all right. We have 2 more people joining us. We're glad to have you with us. When we seek to escape, as I say, the 2 mechanisms are conformity and submission. Both of these, for Erich Fromm, are ways of denying our humanity. And to use some of the very metaphors that he uses, these lead to destruction. They are destructive. They are destructive for our society. They are destructive for our own personhood and integrity. And in the end, they can lead to and foster insanity, which he describes in his book as, in effect, ultimate psychic or mental death. Pardon?
I heard something similar.
Okay, share that with us if you would.
You said, I heard it was freedom and
well, originally he talks. Yeah.
Some people choose freedom and some people choose safety.
Right. Well, of course, those mechanisms of the coping mechanisms that grow out of fear are designed to make us feel safe, but they're inauthentic. They really are a path that leads us away from the goal of becoming a fully functioning human person. So the escapes are always negative. The alternative, of course, is, and this is my fourth point, the path to maturity or to sanity, or to put the matter in more religious terms, the path to salvation is a path of productive work and indeed enduring love. Engagement in a positive way with the world, as opposed to trying to escape the world, is the path forward for us. Now, as I thought a lot and recently because of Mark's request to do this, and as I thought a lot when I was reading Fromm, I want to say that I realized even though he does not consider himself to be a believer in God or a practicing Jew, he characterizes himself, by the way, as a non-theistic mystic. Nonetheless, this shows the, I think, rather profound influence that his Jewish heritage had on him. Because if you read through the Hebrew Bible and you read, or the Christian Old Testament, same thing, you basically see time and time again this idea of a choice between two ways or two paths. You see that in the book of Deuteronomy, where the book of Deuteronomy has God saying to Moses and to the people, I've set before you the way of life and the way of death, therefore choose life. If you read through the book of Psalms, especially the opening psalm, which many biblical scholars think is an introduction to the themes of that book, you have these two ways, the path of righteousness and the path of the wicked. And I see those themes woven through Erich Fromm and exactly the point that you're making. When confronted with freedom, we have two paths. We have a way that leads to all of the metaphors he uses: authentic freedom, individuation, the finding of the true self, the path of life. Or out of fear, if we choose the other path, it's a path that leads to destruction, self-destructive behavior, destructive behavior in relation to other people, and even destructive behavior to the nature of the universe from which we have come. And so Fromm is challenging us to embrace maturity, embrace authentic freedom, embrace the freedom for others and for ourselves. And of course, one of his principal themes is that we do that not only in productive and meaningful engagement and work, but we also do that through love. Probably his most widely read book that virtually everyone is aware of is his book, The Art of Loving. And in that, Fromm defines love as much more than just a feeling or a sentiment, the way we tend to use love in our world today. But really, for Fromm, love is the development of one's character and the aspects of one's character that involve, in addition to the ability to give oneself to someone else, to the world, and back to oneself, it involves the aspects of care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. You know, if you were to ask me what are the kind of touchstones of Fromm's working ethics, it would be to actualize love and act in a manner that is caring, responsible, respectful, and involves knowledge. That's not a bad setup, I think, for organizing the principles of our lives. When we think about then these four main concepts, and clearly each one of them could be looked at in greater detail, and there are other salient things that Fromm addresses. I think he confronts us with a couple of questions that we need to wrestle with, and I would just share three of those with you. The first is, how free am I as an individual? How free am I as I move in the larger social relationships and in our culture? How free am I in relation to the world? Secondly, how am I experiencing and expressing my freedom? Am I seeking to actualize that freedom? We're back to those two paths. Or out of fear, which you have rightly pointed out, am I seeking to escape that freedom through mechanisms of escape, many and varied though they are, but predominantly in society through either conformity, the kind of herd mentality, I'm just a cog in the wheel, or through submission. And then what do I need to be doing in my own life and in my relationships with others and in the world so that I can keep on the path of freedom and keep actualizing my life? And that brings me to the final part of this presentation, and then we can open it up for questions or comments. What is Erich Fromm's relevance for today's world? And I really think in some ways that is the most important question. I mean, if you are a lover of intellectual history, and indeed I hope you are, you can read Erich Fromm, but you can also read a whole host of other persons. But if you are interested in dealing specifically with some of the issues we're facing today, I think that Erich Fromm's work is quite relevant. Certainly one of the aspects of that relevance is just challenging us to ask those three questions I posed a moment ago. I believe that those are basic human questions that we all wrestle with, whatever our religious background, whatever our philosophical assumptions, whatever our place in society, our social location. Those are good questions for us to wrestle with. But as I said, as I read Erich Fromm, there is a very specific relevance, I think, to his work that applies to us today. And that's what I really kind of want to zero in on and really tried to set up in what I've said before. We are living in a period socially that is characterized, and numerous authors and social commentators have brought this to our opinion. We are living in a world where we see the rise of authoritarianism and the threat that this has as a phenomenon to our own democracy. As an example, since we're meeting here in a library, I'll recommend a book. I know our library has it. The late Madeleine Albright's recent book, Fascism, A Warning, is but one of many books that documents the rise of authoritarian persons and authoritarian structures that become indeed a threat to our democracy. If you follow the news at all, you are, I hope, aware of many of these dictators that are present in our world, persons who, if they are not necessarily dictators in the classic sense, do represent what Erich Fromm calls an authoritarian personality that does seek to want to dominate other people. We have only to look at such figures, quite frankly, as Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey. Certainly on the news, the actions of Vladimir Putin, not only within Russia, but within Ukraine. And any of you who have followed the recent French elections, you know that Marine Le Pen represents this strain of authoritarian nationalism. And fortunately, I think for the Western world in particular, she lost, was defeated in her effort. But the ideology that she promotes is what this authoritarian nationalism that really is a threat to our democracy and our social structures. Obviously, in Erich Fromm's day, given the brief sketch I did of his life and the years in which he lived, he saw this spirit embodied in people like Mussolini and fascism in Italy, Hitler, and obviously Nazism in Germany, and also Stalin and what Stalin had done in the old Soviet Union. He has really some very interesting writings where he is something of a fan of Marx and goes on to show the ways in which Lenin to some degree and then Stalin to a greater degree really subverted the ideas of Marx. And so, we could go on and list others, but clearly we're seeing this not only in the world, but I think we're seeing this, and I'm skating on a little bit of thin ice here because we're getting into what might be construed as partisan politics, but we see this same events, I think, unfolding and occurring in our own country in a variety of ways that I will allude to. But what I think is even more frightening and makes Erich Fromm more relevant is this whole question of why is it that these people are able to come to power? What is it about the masses of people that somehow enable and make possible the continuing existence of these authoritarian personalities? And I think very clearly Erich Fromm provides an answer to that. People are afraid of the freedom that they have experienced. And therefore, one of the things they do is conform, but another thing that they do is submit. They submit themselves to an authoritarian person. And therefore, they get a sense of security and conformity to the herd and the mindset. But basically, what they are doing is they are giving up their freedom. So I think that Erich, they are emancipated from structures that gave them identity. You know, again, one of the analogies Fromm would use is when a child is birthed from the womb of the mother, in the womb, there is peace, there is security, there is nurture. And then all of a sudden that child is thrust into the world and realizes that they're hungry, they're dependent. And in an analogous kind of way, that happens to us in our journey through history. You know, again, he sees the being casting out of the garden. And, you know, he has an interesting little interpretation of the cherubim that are standing there preventing Adam and Eve from going back in. They're now out there on their own in the world. Fromm sees that as a good thing because that's a step into freedom. They are no longer dependent in the way they were before, but with that independence comes this fear, this anxiety, this sense of dislocation. And so we find ways to cope with that. You know, I think he does two things. I think he diagnoses the problem very well. The problem with not only authoritarian persons, but people who submit to authoritarian leadership is truly a fear of freedom. These are people that are frightened and scared. They're not in touch with themselves. They've lost a sense of development and hope. And so they just, among other mechanisms, they just simply give their freedom over. If I'm unsure of myself and afraid, I might just say to Mark, you know, tell me what to do. Tell me who I am. Tell me how to live. And, you know, whether it's cults or extreme forms of fundamentalism in various religious settings or authoritarian settings in politics, there are people that simply want to give themselves over. Scholars have wrestled with how did Hitler come to power? With Germany being one of the most educated, supposedly forward-leaning states in Europe at that time. And again, it was because of a variety of sociological issues and economic issues, but those merely became triggers for this willingness on the part of people to submit to the Nazi ideology for what they felt was their safety and security and sense of identity. Now, he diagnoses that very well. I think you look at all of the things going on, and I want to wrap up here quickly because I want to create opportunity for discussion. But you look at all the things going on in our world today, the breakdown of our sane and rational kind of political discourse, even in the midst of difference. You look at all of these conspiracy theories from QAnon. You look at that group of people that gathered in Dallas, Texas, fully expecting Jack Kennedy or his son to come back. I mean, these are people not only possessing a herd mentality, but submitting themselves to these images and metaphors of either authoritarian leadership or authoritarian personality. The solution, I think, the diagnosis, you know, he's a psychoanalyst, he diagnoses the problem well. Submission is one form of escape. It's an escape mechanism, but the solution is, again, we've already hinted at this again and again, is to become a healthy, sane, well-developed person. Develop your individuality in a constructive and healthy way. And the marks of that mature person is production, productive living, not just being a cog in the wheels of a machine, but engaging in a productive relationship with self, with others, and with the world. Become a loving person. That is a person who is careful, takes responsibility, shows respect, and seeks knowledge. Now, I didn't want to do any reading to you and trying to find a key passage that sort of holds all this together as a conclusion was difficult, but I do want to read in conclusion, and then we'll have some discussion, just a short paragraph from Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom. And if you have not read anything of Erich Fromm and want to start, I would really recommend Escape from Freedom. I know everybody says read The Art of Loving, and that's a good read, but I think really Escape from Freedom touches on a lot of these themes that I was trying to surface for you tonight. But he writes on what is page 21, actually the end of the chapter entitled Freedom, a Psychological Problem. And he writes these words. He's talking about the whole discussion about the meaning and the lack of freedom in the modern world in the course of time in his analysis of the Reformation and of fascism. And then he concludes by saying this: this discussion will always be centered around the main theme of this book, that man, now I apologize, Erich Fromm did not use a lot of inclusive language, but that was because he was a product of his time. That man, the more he gains freedom in the sense of emerging from the original oneness with man and nature, and the more he becomes an individual, he has no choice but to unite himself with the world in the spontaneity of love and productive work, or, remember I said two ways, or else to seek a kind of security by such ties with the world as destroy his freedom and the integrity of his individual self. That's really the challenge that Erich Fromm, I think, puts before us. And I hope in some small way that I have encouraged you to seek further reading and engagement with this thinker, who I believe is very important. So thank you. Any questions, comments from either people present here in the room or he lived from 1900, March 23rd was his birthday, to 1980. Died in Switzerland on March 18th, just 5 days before his 80th birthday. So,
loving and working in Freud.
Is what?
Is close to Freud's concept.
Oh, absolutely. And yes and no. I mean, clearly he has studied and read Freud. He understands himself to be significantly different from Freud, because Freud would, there's several reasons to be a little bit technical here. Freud would understand human nature to be constant and to be driven principally by biology. And so Erich Fromm would think that's reductionism. He would want to draw from Freud's insights, but he also wants to have a role for society, a role for religious traditions in a positive way, a role for art and things that Freud tended to reduce to basic biological instincts and drives.
He talks about the actualization to be similar to some of the others, like Maslow.
He would be like Maslow. Karen Horney would be one of the persons that he would and I'm taxing my memory a little bit. I don't know that he cites Jung a lot, but he would be very interested in seeing this kind of collective experience of humanity that cannot be reduced to sheer biology and instinctual drives. That would be his critique of Freud. He several times in books he's written, he refers to what he calls humanistic psychoanalysis.
Well, and the humanistic people, who are they?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're right.
There's shades of all these people in this area.
Absolutely. And then there are people that would consider themselves to be humanistic thinkers and philosophers that might move in a different direction. Fromm really is comprehensive. I mean, you read through like the Sane Society, as I mentioned, he has a fairly detailed and I think pretty accurate analysis of modern capitalistic economics beginning in in the early 18th century and coming up through. But he's always interested in the question, how does what's going on in the world right now impact or affect a person in his or her journey? Right, the actualization. And he sees that as kind of, to use a Platonic word, a dialectic. We are not wholly shaped by our culture, but we are not wholly shaped by our nature, our biological nature, like Freud thought. There is this constant interaction, but there is within us this drive toward wholeness, which is often derailed because of the anxiety and the fear we feel when we are emancipated. It's interesting that the book Escape from Freedom, I like that title, but when it was published in the United Kingdom, it was published under the title The Fear of Freedom.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and so, and I honestly don't know which title he would have preferred. I'm assuming Escape from Freedom since it was published, but that clearly, I think that's a little better because fear captures the underlying mode, but escape really surfaces these mechanisms of escape that we employ, conformity, etc. Other comments or questions? And I'm really open-ended here. If any of you who have read Fromm, you may have a different take on what is important to him. There is just so much there, but I really think that I'm going to stand by this, although I'm open to other readings. I really think, given the authoritarian tendencies in our world today, understanding those is very important, and Fromm helps us understand those. That's why I said he helps us diagnose where we are culturally and historically at this time. And I think, again, he comes back to that perennial prescription: be healthy, have a healthy psychosocial, spiritual, however you understand. I think he is a spiritual writer, though he himself is open about not having theistic beliefs. He thinks that those can be of value. He spends a lot of time analyzing the early Christian movement and what happened when suddenly it ceased becoming a movement for the poor and the underclass and a movement for justice, and suddenly became the institution of the Roman Empire and all that was entailed. And of course he's done extensive studies in Talmudic literature and Judaism. So he does see value, and he would claim, by the way, that nothing he's writing is all that original. It just is something that, and I think he might have picked this up from Karl Jaspers, that Axel age where some great thinkers, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Buddha, Moses, he wants to draw from all of that wisdom. Other
many of us don't realize that we're not free. That's who we think that we are, and if we don't know
right.
that we need to escape to something.
Yeah, well, right. We in our efforts to be emancipated, we want to escape everything that means. When we, again, it's this freedom from and freedom to, the freedom to act and be a responsible person. So you always have to remember that freedom has two sides. That's part of what he's saying. Again, we're up to two ways. Every advance that we make has the potential for derailment or the potential to move us forward in a positive direction, to take literally the next step.
Are there any questions from the online audience? If you have questions, you can unmute yourself. It looks like people are muted, but if you unmute yourself, you can ask.
Sounding political, but the force of some of the groups today are frightening.
Oh, yeah,
Absolutely frightening. And
this to me is what, I mean, this was the excitement when Mark asked me to do this. I think Fromm really does diagnose some of the stuff that we're seeing right here in this country. You know, and
about someone who I know who's an anti-vaxxer.
well, sure.
And I keep trying to convince her. Mother. And then finally I said, I'm not harassing you anymore. You just tell me. And she said, Lynn, you have to understand. This country don't believe, which is what you're talking about, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, when you give yourself over to, you know, remember again, back to what I said at one point, the kind of the hallmark of his ethics are things like care, responsibility, but the other one that's very important is knowledge. You know, you.
She's getting her information from me.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you know, you can take every one of those and see the inverse as part of those two ways: ignorance, irresponsibility, a lack of compassion. This is where you see this in discourse today. You no longer say to your political opponent, "You're wrong." You demonize them. You know, you call them names. We went through a period of that with the previous administration where. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, humility is also one of the virtues he talks about. And again, that perennial wisdom of just realizing that there is, you know, another one of his polarities is constructive versus destructive. Authoritarian personalities tend to be destructive, and people who, you know, you just go down the line too. He also relates that to the classic psychoanalytic sadism and masochism. And we think of sadists and masochists as wanting to destroy each other, but they need each other. That's the point he's trying to make. Many of these cop-outs are ways that we employ to give us a sense of security. I'm sorry, Mark, did someone online want to?
So far, no.
Oh, okay.
I'll repeat the question. Does anyone online, would anyone online like to make a comment or ask a question? Yeah. I've tried to unmute everyone. I think a couple people are still muted, but if you'd like to speak, just unmute yourself.
Pardon?
How many Zoom participants do we have?
Let's see. 5. Yeah. All right. Well, if there are anybody care to make a closing comment or?
I just wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
I apologize that we were late.
That's okay.
Now I got my time confused. You were talking about the defenses, the mechanism
Mhm.
to avoid, and denial was where I came in. How many were there?
Oh, well, I think
How many were there that you mentioned?
I just mentioned the two that Fromm stresses in the modern period, and that is conformity. That tends to be the primary response and impact that capitalist societies have, where people are just reduced to a means and not treated as an end, and people cope by simply conforming to that. I'll punch in at 8, I'll punch out at 4, and then the other is submission, which makes possible the rise of authoritarianism. Those are the two, and those tend to work them. Well, I was saying that that if you take each of the things that he mentions as aspects of love, you can see the inverse in those. As again, there are a number of polarities in Erich Fromm, like sanity is the goal. The failure to achieve that leads to insanity. Becoming a constructive, productive person, the failure to do that leads to destructiveness. Learning to affirm oneself, love oneself, care for oneself is opposite these escape mechanisms. And you can go right down the line, kind of.
Dave,
He analyzes a number of those individually, which is where he brings to bear his psychoanalytic background. He analyzes culturally, where he brings to bear his sociological background. And he does see that same dynamic in productive versus destructive religious movements. He would say the teachings of Jesus and early Christianity were constructive. The post-Constantinian church was destructive.
Dave, we have a question in the
Okay, we have a
comments
question.
from an online attendee. Ron asks, how do you approach someone who is being driven by the constant barrage of fear? Or what would Fromm say to that, I guess?
That's an excellent question. And I think, I'm sorry, the question was, how would you approach or relate to or try to influence someone who is driven by fear? Is that the question?
Yes, a constant barrage of fear.
Constant, yeah. I think that very simply, he would say you continue to try to love and nurture that person's humanity, and you do what you can at that point. You know, when the question arose, there is an interesting quote in the New Testament, which says, perfect love casts out fear. And I don't ever recall reading Fromm citing that, but I think that is consistent with the answer he would give. You love them, and you try to provide them. He writes a lot about mother love. You know, mother love is absolute, unlike father love. This is Freud slips in here. Father love is always conditional, especially in more primitive patriarchal cultures. The sons in particular had to conform to the wishes of the father. The mother loves unconditionally, is always there for the child, and the child is absolutely dependent as he or she grows up on that. I think that would, to some degree, answer the question how you reach out to someone who is constantly surrounded by fear. You don't necessarily give them a hug, because Fromm does not see love as totally sentimental, but you are constantly there to constructively give yourself to them in a meaningful and healthy way. And for some people, all you can do is kind of model that and affirm that for them. And then in the end, I mean, Fromm is big on freedom. They have to come to that point. You can't force that. That's where all of these derailments comes in. You know, authoritarian people promise you the moon, but they ask you to lose your soul in the process. And so someone driven by fear, I think, really needs love in the sense in which Erich Fromm articulates it.